May 1940. Across the fields of northern France, German tanks slice through Allied lines like a blade through silk. Entire divisions vanish into encirclements. Roads choke with refugees and retreating soldiers. Within weeks, France, the nation that held the trenches for 4 years in the last war, crumbles. The British flee at Dunkirk. Western Europe falls. Back in the Reich, propaganda newsreels trumpet a new age of warfare. This is Blitzkrieg, they say, lightning war, Hitler's secret superweapon, a revolutionary doctrine that renders all previous military thinking obsolete. Speed, steel, terror, the perfect synthesis of tanks, aircraft, and tactical genius. And here's the part that made the story irresistible. Germany won because they discovered something no one else understood. A code, a formula, a way of war so advanced their enemies never stood a chance. It's a hell of a story. It's also largely a myth. The word Blitzkrieg itself tells you everything you need to know. You won't find it in Wehrmacht field manuals. It doesn't appear in official German operational doctrine. The term was born in newsrooms and propaganda offices, not in the corridors of the German General Staff. When Western journalists watched German forces overrun Poland in September 1939, they reached for a word to capture the shocking speed: lightning war, Blitzkrieg. It had a ring to it, dramatic, modern, the kind of word that sells newspapers and fills radio broadcasts. The Nazi propaganda machine, never one to miss an opportunity, grabbed the term and ran with it. Joseph Goebbels understood theatrics. If the world wanted to believe Germany possessed a secret military science, why correct them? The myth became a weapon in itself, demoralizing enemies before the first shot, suggesting an inevitability to German victory that simply didn't exist. Inside the Wehrmacht, commanders were doing something far less magical. They were applying concepts their predecessors had been refining for decades. The German military tradition emphasized Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, going back to the wars of unification in the 1860s and 1870s. The idea was simple: maneuver and encirclement trump frontal assault and attrition. Avoid getting stuck in grinding positional warfare. Find the enemy's weakness, exploit it with speed and coordination, destroy their ability to fight coherently. This concept of Vernichtungsgedanke, the battle of annihilation, had been central to German operational thinking since the elder Moltke. It wasn't about occupying territory, it was about destroying the enemy's capacity to resist through decisive engagement. The Prussian General Staff built its reputation on this approach long before anyone coined the word Blitzkrieg. After the disaster of World War I, the German military rebuilt from scratch under severe restrictions imposed by Versailles. General Hans von Seeckt, chief architect of the new Reichswehr in the 1920s, took those limitations and turned them into opportunity. With a small professional force capped at 100,000 men, he emphasized quality over quantity, initiative over rigid obedience, combined arms integration. Von Seeckt created a system where every soldier trained above his rank. Enlisted men learned junior officer skills, junior officers trained for senior command. The idea was to build a cadre that could rapidly expand in wartime without losing effectiveness. Officers learned to think flexibly, to exploit opportunities, to make decisions independently when circumstances demanded. War games and exercises stressed realistic scenarios, not parade ground perfection. This wasn't innovation for its own sake. It was adaptation to Germany's strategic reality, a nation surrounded by potential enemies, limited in force size, needing to win quickly if war came. By the time Hitler came to power and began rearming in the 1930s, the foundations were already in place. Tanks, dive bombers, motorized infantry, these were new tools, yes, but they were being integrated to an existing framework, not inventing one from whole cloth. Guderian's theories about concentrated armored formations drew on British and French tank theorists like Fuller and de Gaulle. The Luftwaffe's doctrine of close air support evolved from observing the Spanish Civil War. These weren't secrets, they were adaptations of ideas circulating openly in military journals across Europe. When the Wehrmacht rolled into Poland on September 1, 1939, they weren't unveiling a secret formula. They were executing a modernized version of ideas that had been developing for 2 decades, and they were facing an opponent with severe disadvantages. The Polish military was brave, no question, but it was also dispersed, trying to defend an impossibly long frontier with outdated equipment and inadequate air support. Polish forces were spread thin, attempting to protect industrial regions along the German border rather than falling back to more defensible positions. Somewhere near Krakow, a Polish captain stares at his map. He's been ordered to hold a 30-kilometer front. He has 2 understrength battalions and a handful of anti-tank guns. German intelligence shows a full panzer division bearing down on his position. He knows the math, he knows how this ends, but orders are orders. German forces didn't win through mysterious tactical sorcery. They won through better coordination, superior numbers in key sectors, and exploiting gaps in Polish deployments. The campaign lasted 5 weeks, but it wasn't effortless. German casualties were higher than propaganda suggested, over 16,000 dead, thousands more wounded. Tanks broke down at alarming rates, supply lines stretched thin, coordination between army groups was often improvised. The rapid advance created as many headaches as it solved. When the Soviets invaded from the east on September 17th, Poland's fate was sealed, but German commanders were already learning that speed came with costs. Then came France. If any campaign cemented the Blitzkrieg legend, it was the 6-week conquest of Western Europe in May and June 1940. On paper, the Allies had the advantage: more tanks, more men, defensive positions along the Maginot Line. Britain and France combined outmatched Germany in sheer resources. So how did it all collapse so quickly? The popular story says Blitzkrieg. The reality says something messier. The German plan for France, Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, wasn't even the first plan. The initial scheme called for a straightforward push through Belgium, similar to the Schlieffen Plan from World War I. Conventional, predictable. Some German commanders thought it would lead to exactly the kind of bloody stalemate they wanted to avoid. Then, a stroke of luck. In January 1940, a German liaison aircraft carrying operational plans crash-landed in Belgium. The Belgians got their hands on the documents. The element of surprise was blown. German planners had to rethink everything. Enter Erich von Manstein, a staff officer with a bolder idea. Instead of the obvious route through Belgium, what if the main thrust came through the Ardennes? The Ardennes were considered impassable for large armored formations, densely wooded, hilly, narrow roads. The French High Command assumed no one would be crazy enough to try it, but Manstein argued that's exactly why it could work. Concentrate panzer divisions there, punch through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River at Sedan, then drive west to the Channel coast, cutting the Allied armies in 2. Audacious, risky, it worked. But here's what the Blitzkrieg legend leaves out. It almost didn't work. The crossing at Sedan on May 13, 1940 was touch and go. French artillery and infantry put up fierce resistance. German engineers are building a pontoon bridge across the Meuse. French machine guns cut down the first wave. A 24-year-old engineering lieutenant from Saxony watches his men fall into the water. He has a choice: pull back or push forward. He screams the order. The next section rushes ahead. The bridge grows, meter by meter, under fire. By evening, tanks are crossing. He takes shrapnel an hour past midnight. He'll never know this bridge changed the war. The breakthrough succeeded in part because of aggressive leadership from commanders like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, men willing to push their units hard and ignore orders to slow down. Guderian, commanding 19th Panzer Corps, personally crossed the Meuse with his forward elements, driving his staff to distraction. Rommel, leading 7th Panzer Division, kept his tanks moving through the night, denying the French time to establish coherent defensive lines. It succeeded because the Luftwaffe provided close air support at critical moments, keeping French reinforcements off balance. Stuka dive bombers with their screaming sirens terrorized French positions more through psychological effect than actual destructive power. And it succeeded because the French command structure was slow to respond. Communication between Allied headquarters was disjointed. French commanders, trained in methodical First World War-style operations, struggled to process the speed of events. Orders took hours to travel up and down the chain of command. At the headquarters of the French 9th Army, a general stares at his map. Reports arrive 6-8 hours late. One division reports German tanks at Dinant, another reports encirclement at Montfermeil. Where's the real threat? Where should he commit his reserves? While he deliberates, German armored spearheads are already racing west, and his options are evaporating. By the time French and British commanders realized the true scale of the threat, German tanks were already racing toward the coast, and options for counterattack were evaporating. The Germans didn't win because they had a perfect plan. They won because they were faster to adapt, faster to exploit openings, and because their opponents were paralyzed by doctrine that prioritized control over initiative. When British forces evacuated from Dunkirk at the end of May, German commanders were already noticing cracks in their own system. Tank divisions had outrun infantry by dozens of kilometers. Supply lines were stretched. Fuel trucks couldn't keep pace with advancing panzers. Uncoordinated Allied counterattacks, like the British strike at Arras on May 21st, showed that German columns were vulnerable to flank fire. Hitler ordered the armored units to halt at Dunkirk, allowing nearly 300,000 British and French soldiers to escape. Why? Partly Hitler's concerns about tank losses, partly Goering's promises that the Luftwaffe could finish the encircled forces from the air. The Luftwaffe couldn't. The British got away. That breathing space allowed Britain to preserve a core of trained troops that would later prove critical. The subsequent fall of France looked inevitable, but it wasn't predestined. French forces fought with mixed success until the armistice in late June. The campaign cost the Wehrmacht around 50,000 killed and over 100,000 wounded. That's not trivial. Tank losses were significant, but France's political will collapsed faster than its army. That's an important distinction. Blitzkrieg as a concept relied not just on military defeat, but on psychological collapse, on the idea that speed and shock would break the enemy's will to resist. In France, it worked. But did it work everywhere? The so-called lightning wars weren't as clean as propaganda made them seem. Losses were significant. Equipment attrition was high. After the Poland campaign, German tank units needed weeks to refit and repair. Nearly 30% of armored vehicles required major maintenance. In France, the percentages were similar. The deeper German forces pushed into enemy territory, the harder it became to keep them supplied. Fuel trucks couldn't keep pace with advancing panzers. Ammunition stocks ran low. Infantry divisions, still largely horse-drawn, lagged miles behind the spearheads. These weren't minor inconveniences. They were fundamental constraints that limited how far and how fast German forces could realistically operate. This was true even in France, where the distances were relatively short and the infrastructure relatively good. Imagine the problem scaled up. Which brings us to the real test, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Here was the ultimate challenge: vast distances, poor roads, an enemy with enormous reserves of manpower and industrial capacity. If Blitzkrieg was truly a revolutionary doctrine, a key to unstoppable victory, this was where it should have shined. Instead, it revealed every limitation baked into the approach. The opening weeks looked spectacular. German forces encircled entire Soviet armies, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, thousands of tanks and aircraft destroyed or captured. By August, German units were closing in on Leningrad and Kiev. By October, they were fighting in the suburbs of Moscow. The newsreels showed triumph, but behind the scenes, the Wehrmacht was bleeding out. Casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. Trucks and tanks wore out on terrible roads. Many Soviet routes weren't roads at all, just packed dirt that turned to mud. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point. In a railway yard outside Smolensk, a German logistics officer calculates tonnage. His division needs 300 tons of supplies daily. The Soviet rail gauge is different from European standard. Every locomotive has to have its wheels changed, or they need to build new infrastructure. The numbers don't work. They never work. He does the math anyway, sends the report up the chain, and watches the fuel shortage reports pile up on his desk. Locomotives and rail cars were in short supply. The Soviets traded space for time, pulling back, regrouping, hitting German flanks. And when winter came, the offensive stalled. Blitzkrieg as a concept assumed you could win the decisive battle, force the enemy to collapse, and end the war before logistics became a nightmare. It assumed the enemy would break psychologically, that speed and shock would create panic and paralysis. The Soviets didn't break. They absorbed the blows, fell back, and kept fighting. Stalin's regime was brutal enough to hold the line through sheer terror and ruthlessness. The deeper the Germans advanced, the more their advantages eroded. By December 1941, the Wehrmacht was stuck in a war of attrition, exactly the kind of war Blitzkrieg was supposed to avoid. And it wasn't just the Eastern Front. Even in earlier campaigns, the model had limits. The Balkans campaign in spring 1941 looked swift on the map, but it delayed Barbarossa by crucial weeks. Weeks that would matter enormously when winter arrived. North Africa turned into a seesaw of advances and retreats, where Rommel's boldness couldn't compensate for chronic supply shortages. Malta remained in British hands, throttling Axis supply convoys. The myth of the unstoppable Panzer Division started to crack. Tanks needed fuel, infantry needed rest, air superiority wasn't guaranteed, and enemies, once they figured out German tactics, could adapt. By 1942 and 1943, Germany's strategic situation was deteriorating on every front. The Soviets were learning how to coordinate their own combined arms offensives. Soviet deep battle doctrine, ironically developed in the 1930s, proved devastatingly effective once the Red Army rebuilt its officer corps and received enough equipment. The Western Allies were massing resources for a return to Europe. Germany couldn't keep running the same playbook and expecting different results. The industrial balance was shifting decisively against them. The United States was producing tanks, aircraft, and ships at rates Germany couldn't hope to match. Blitzkrieg or no Blitzkrieg, the numbers told a story. So why couldn't Germany just keep rerunning 1940? Because 1940 was never a repeatable formula. It was a specific set of circumstances, a bold operational plan, an enemy caught off guard, commanders willing to take risks, and a healthy dose of luck. You can't bottle lightning, and trying to scale that approach up to continental distances against better prepared enemies with superior resources was a recipe for disaster, which is exactly what happened. The Blitzkrieg myth endures because it's dramatic. It fits our desire for clean explanations. We want to believe wars are won by brilliant innovations, by master strokes of genius, by some hidden advantage that changes everything. The messy reality is harder to sell. Wars are won by logistics as much as by tactics, by industrial capacity, by the ability to replace losses and sustain operations over time, by avoiding catastrophic mistakes, and yes, by skill and courage on the battlefield, but not by magic. The Wehrmacht from 1939 to 1941 was a highly competent fighting force. Its officers were well trained, its combined arms tactics were effective. It benefited from opponents who made serious errors in deployment and command. But it wasn't invincible. It wasn't following some revolutionary doctrine unknown to the rest of the world. It was doing what militaries do: adapting tools and ideas to circumstances, improvising, exploiting opportunities, and sometimes getting lucky. The word Blitzkrieg is a piece of marketing, a way to package complex historical reality into something that fits a headline. The myth of Blitzkrieg as Hitler's secret superweapon is a story we tell ourselves because it makes the victories seem more impressive and the defeats less painful.
But if you dig into the archives, talk to the historians who spent decades studying these campaigns, the picture that emerges is different, messier, more human, less about genius and more about grinding, imperfectly coordinated, terrifyingly costly war fought by men who were making it up as they went along more often than they'd ever admit. And maybe that's the real lesson here, the one that matters most. The most dangerous myths aren't the ones about technology or tactics. They're the ones that make war look easy, that turn brutal, grinding campaigns into clean narratives of inevitable victory. Because when we believe in lightning war, in quick solutions and decisive strikes, we forget what war actually costs. We forget the engineers dying on pontoon bridges, the logistics officers whose math never adds up, the Polish captain staring at his map, knowing the numbers don't work. Blitzkrieg was never a formula for easy victory. It was men and machines pushed to breaking point, gambling everything on speed because they had no other choice.
And when that gamble failed, when distance and winter and sheer human endurance broke the myth, what remained was the oldest truth of all. Wars aren't won by secrets. They're won by the side that can endure longer, produce more, and refuse to break. Everything else is just marketing.